foggy morning, and under those low-light conditions, the lake's whiskered residents were prowling the shallows. Pelicans, on the other hand, seemed to be more or less grounded. I like to imagine what they might be saying to each other when they're all huddled together like that. Sort of like, "Hey, did you just slip off the rock?" "Well, the rock is slippery because it's drenched in pelican poo. I don't understand why everyone has to be just all together on this one rock." "Yeah, there's hundreds of rocks over there, and some of them aren't even drenched in pelican poo yet. You could go over there." "I'm not going over there. There's one of those humans over there." "Oh, humans are slow-moving and dumb. They don't even have wings. What could it do to you?" "Have you ever seen one poo?" "Well, no. I just don't trust a creature that eats but never poos. Something's gotta give eventually. That thing is nothing but a ticking time bomb." "All right, I guess you just have to stay on the rock with everybody else." Imagine if the only food you have ever eaten were small, oily fish that also gave you constant diarrhea until the entire landscape for miles around began to look as splattered as a Jackson Pollock canvas. That is how a pelican do. I mean, can they take off from the water without flapping their wings, just by the sheer propulsive force of the diarrhea? Anyway, the fog began to lift, but the fishing was a little slow. I was picking off a white bass here, a catfish there. Now, you can use all kinds of flies for this, but in general, the most common fly I'm using is a clouser minnow. Frequently a jig hook clouser, because that 90-degree bend in the jig hook will prevent the dumbbell eyes of the clouser minnow from twisting around the shank of the hook. But in this particular day, I wanted a fly with a little bit bigger head that had lots of flash and could attract fish from further away because they were a little bit scattered. So I'm using an articulated clouser that has the dumbbell eyes just tied onto a shank with a big, a nice big head spun up on that shank. And then a number 6 bait holder hook is just articulated onto the back of that with 20-pound mono so it doesn't flap around and tangle up with the tippet all the time. So anyway, the fish were scattered. I mean, look how far out I had to wade just to get to where the fish were. And there wasn't even a big school out there, just picking off 1 or 2 here or there. Eventually I gave up, but as I was paddling back to the boat ramp, the sun came out and the wind picked up a little bit, and so I decided to try one last point. And sure enough, there was a big stallion of a wiper right off that point. Just take a look at that. No doubt on a 5-weight fly rod. That was an epic fight. But it can't be all pelican jokes and stallion wipers. Get ready for a shallow dive on family Bulletacea. But first, a little discussion of an error in reasoning called confirmation bias. Should walk that back a bit. It's not a fallacy of presumption, which is what we would normally call bias. I think it actually goes into the starting point assumptions that a person needs to use in order to begin a chain of reasoning. Let's suppose I said to you that chanterelles were mushrooms that were good to eat, and they were yellow. They were shaped like a vase or a trumpet perhaps, or a martini glass a little bit, that they had false gills, and that they emerged from the ground around oak trees. The people who are led into a misidentification by confirmation bias are not unintelligent people. In fact, I think the more intelligent a person is, the more they may struggle with this. So none of these examples have been a chanterelle. And in fact, we could play this game for hours without showing a chanterelle. The important thing to understand is that your brain is going to try to trick you into believing that you're seeing what you want to see. So family Boletaceae, the boletes, are a family of generally ectomycorrhizal, meaning the fruiting bodies will emerge from the underground mycelium through the ground. And they generally have a sponge-like hymenium or pore surface underneath the cap. It's actually a layer of tubes extending downward from the context of the cap. The genus name in this case derived from a Chinese doctor, Lan Mao, who was one of the first to study boletes. On this episode of How to Cut Your Hand, Unsafe Knife Handling. But you can see the blue staining extending here into the flesh of the cap. The progression of this staining, along with some minor details like the bottomness of the cap versus reddish brown, and the little bit of yellowness at the base of the stem and so forth, are some of the details that separate Pseudosensibilis from Sensibilis, or also Pallidorosea or Morangia bicolor, or some of the others that may be confused with it. There's a rule of thumb with boletes that says if the fruiting body does not have bright red, if it does not have bright yellow, and if it does not stain blue, then it's safe to eat. And in this case, we see the old Landmoa pseudosensibilis does not have bright yellow or red or stained blue, but the fresh ones have all three of those characteristics. So just even with a rule of thumb that would generally be accepted by most mycologists, there are still exceptions to that rule, and you just need to be aware and very careful and very cautious. This rule of thumb does not apply to all mushrooms, only to boletes, those mushrooms that have the sponge-like hymenium. If a mushroom passes the rule of thumb, it doesn't mean that it's good, it doesn't mean that it tastes good, it just means that it's not widely considered to be toxic. There are lots of Tylopolis species, for instance, that although they're not considered to be toxic, are so bitter that you wouldn't want to eat them anyway. So they would pass the rule of thumb, but are still inedible. Remember in the previous episode we talked about Hypomyces lactiflorum. This is a related species, Hypomyces chrysospermus, that infects boletes, and eventually it will turn this whole thing yellow. But I did find some Boletus variepes that were not infected with the bolete mold yet. Right beside the path, I appreciate that. So this is Boletus variepes. You'll notice there's no blue staining reaction. I didn't get a close look at the reticulation pattern on the stem, but it does have a kind of a pale reticulation on the stem, which is important in distinguishing Boletus from Lexinum, a very similar appearing mushroom. Here we see Lexinum rugosiceps, which would resemble Boletus variepes, but once you flip it over, you'll see that the stem is not reticulated. It has what's called scabers, and the pore layer, the sponge surface, does not contact the stem. You'll see how deeply inset the stem is into that. And the stem is also kind of more long and curved than you would expect with Boletus variepes. So It doesn't matter as far as table fare is concerned, because both Boletus varieties and Lexinum rugosiceps are edible. There's a good look at the scabers on the stem. They're just kind of tufts of material that have kind of pulled away from the stem and darkened a little bit. And we can see there's no staining reaction. Now, something that could be confused for Lexinum rugosiceps would be the Swillus americanus, like that it emerges around pine trees, associates with pines. You'll see the pore layer there. The common name for these is slippery jacks. The cap cuticle is often kind of slippery. It's so dry this year that it's not that bad, but frequently very slimy cap. So that was a shallow dive on boletes. I'm sure we'll be back for a deeper dive at some point. But for now, let's jump on into the cooking part. You want to peel away the pore layer of boletes, just because you don't want a bunch of fungal spores and weird little tubes in your food. And trim away any parts that have been eaten by bugs or whatnot. I watch a YouTube channel called Pasta Grammar, and a really interesting channel. They don't have very many mushroom recipes. That's how I discovered it. I was looking for mushroom recipes, but they don't have many. What they're great at is discussing the basics of Italian cooking, and it really helped me. But one of the commenters commented that real Parmigiano Reggiano cheese ages for so much longer than Parmesan that it actually winds up being more or less lactose free by the time that the aging process is over. So, boy, it really changed the game as far as by being able to make various dishes with mushrooms. So in this case, bolete pizza, easy win. I'll give that a 8 out of 10.